Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be part 3 of the Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever read-along that I'm doing with a few other booktubers who I will have linked below. This is for the final volume of the first trilogy, which is called The Power That Preserves. I constantly have to stop myself from calling it The Power That Prevails, which is hilarious. What finally got me to stop doing it was realizing that this is the book that the famous Stephen R. Donaldson gets plot ideas from a bottle of Lysol. That is related to this book. So if you don't know about that, I will link to Donaldson's own website where you can read him get increasingly annoyed as he answers fan questions and people keep asking him about the Lysol. It's very funny. It's preservative qualities. Anyway, as with the rest of the series, this has the framing device of Thomas Covenant in the real world at either end, and then his adventures in the fantasy world of the land in between. Unlike the others in the opening section of this one, he's pulled into the land and asks to be sent back almost immediately, so we find out that that's a possibility. The person who's summoning him doesn't need to die to release him when he's midway between worlds, which introduces an interesting thing that we're going to see more of later about balance and the consistency of the magic system that's at play here, which I think is one of the more interesting things that we end up seeing in this book. Unfortunately, the ridiculous reason that he's getting sent back is because he's doing this very dramatic rattlesnake venom sucking thing out of bad television and films. And I will link specifically below to Steve Donahue's doing a discussion for each quarter of these books, and in the first one he talks about how ridiculous that is, because it is not accurate. And I mean, there are bits in this that medically seem off now just because leprosy is now a curable disease and it was on the precipice of that when this was written, so it seems fishy that some of that plays out the way it is, but arguably it works. But this snake stuff, yeah, it didn't work even then. There's also a thing about razor blades in food, and it made me wonder if Donaldson had gotten that from the fake Halloween scares where people falsely reported razor blades and Halloween candy for children. There's a thing with that too. In any case, eventually Covenant does go back to the land, which, because his daughter broke the laws of death in the previous volume, is now all out of balance, and so it doesn't have the old healing properties that it had before. There's no magic healing mud. There are guards who were immortal who are aging now. There's a lot of people being miserable. There is still some ridiculousness. People break bones and still walk on them, and then you go, what was the point of them having this injury if it's not actually... Anyway, that is something that does happen in certain styles of fantasy, so your irritation with that kind of thing may vary. This is also the book where, if you are familiar with the clench drinking game that is famously associated with this series, it's really in full force in this book, so you could become very inebriated, should that be your thing, if you were trying to drink every time you see the word clench in this book, because he's into that. This is also the book where Donaldson starts going over the top with picking a kind of, not necessarily a complicated word, but words that are less used, and will use it once and then run with it for the rest of the story. He also uses whelmed. Not overwhelmed or underwhelmed, but whelmed, which is... I mean, some people really enjoy that style of semi-unnaturalness in writing when it's a fantasy, so if that is your thing when it comes to this style of fantasy, this book will be right up your alley, and you should be reading it because that's how this is written. It's not really my thing, so I thought it was a little ridiculous, but that's very much a matter of taste. As I alluded to with the balance piece, and let me just say straight off, there will be spoilers in this because I will be talking about the ending, because I think that's kind of one of the more interesting parts about it. This does end up being a more traditional fantasy story. You do have Covenant and his giant sidekick, foam follower, who go off to save the world and sacrifice themselves, bring balance to the Force. Wait, no, not the Force. You know, it's that kind of story, but it flows much more naturally. So once we get into an actual resolution or build towards the resolution of this, I think it's quite entertaining, and I like the idea of balancing magics just because I like to see a magic system that has some kind of internal consistency to it. One of the things that I saw on Donaldson's personal site when he was answering these fan questions in the gradual interview was he talks about fantasy worlds being innately not irrational but arational. essentially in response to somebody asking him to clarify the rules of magic within the land. But I think just the idea of balance at least somewhat plays with the idea that there are some kind of rules here. And when we get to the ending where Covenant has kind of a reward for sacrificing himself and saving things, is given the opportunity to either live in the land or return to Earth and not die from the rattlesnake ridiculousness. That choice, which seems like it should violate rules, can happen because it's in the space in between worlds. It's not in Earth, it's not in the land, it's somewhere here. So I thought that was an interesting thing to play with. Although I don't know that the whole balance thing was completely consistent throughout the series. I honestly would have to go back and look at it more carefully, and I just don't want to. But in any case, consistent or not, at least the final third to a quarter of this was quite entertaining, and I would say was probably my second favorite part of this series outside of the military stuff that we got with Heil Troy in the second one. I would still definitely say that this is not the style of fantasy that I prefer, and I think that is definitely the reason that I barely remember this, having read them when I was 13 originally, and that's the reason that this isn't the style of fantasy that I read when I read fantasy now. That said, I was satisfied with this being more entertaining this time. I don't have anything super great to say about it. Again, my biggest issue is still that it introduces a lot of things that are actual things and introduces them purely as metaphor and not as anything real, and that's completely intentional because I did go and read this gradual interview where Donaldson answers questions about them constantly. Without having these things, like the fact that Covenant has leprosy, like the kind of weird interfamily thing that's going on with him and the daughter Elena, like the rape that created Elena from the first book, because Donaldson didn't write them with any kind of intent to have it be more than metaphor, it can only work on one level, and that adds a kind of superficiality to elements that should be adding to something more realistic and more grounded, at least theoretically. So I think that makes it kind of unsatisfying, because on the one hand I actually like to see complicated and ugly things in fantasy, but I just didn't feel like any of this was dealt with in a satisfying way. Which I think is a shame, because I think a lot of the strictly traditional fantasy elements, which we got in that final third to a quarter of this book, worked really well. So yeah, so I'm curious to see now how the sequel trilogy ends up working out, because I have not read those, and yeah, it'll be a different way of experiencing it, I guess. I wish I had more interesting things to say about this one, but even though I found it more enjoyable, I feel like it's less discussion worthy for me, which is kind of too bad. But in any case, if you were reading along with this, I'd love to hear what you think. I know of the other people who are doing this read along with me, there are people who have loved and hated it up to this point, so I'm curious to see where those go. I would also be curious to hear from people who read this for the first time as adults, because I think almost everyone I've talked to, with one or two exceptions, read this originally between the ages of about 12 and 17. And I'd be curious to hear, if you read this for the first time as an adult, how it felt to you on the first reading. In any case, that is the end of this first trilogy. This has been kind of an interesting project because I don't generally talk about single books unless I have something extensive to say about them, and I haven't really with this series. It's the kind of series where if I was reading it on its own, I would give this 3 sentences and a wrap-up and not do anything else. So this it's been interesting to try to think about something else to talk about for these. It's also been interesting in that these are super unpopular, and the most dislikes I get are on these videos. So I feel like I'm not usually somebody who says subscribe and like, but I feel like I should say like or dislike as you see fit, because that seems to be where these go. Anyway, if you're planning to read the next trilogy, I hope you're joining us next month. If not, but you've read it before, I'd love to hear what you think. And if you think it's in line with the original trilogy, and if you liked it as much or more or equally, I'd be curious to know. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.